70% of American adults fail a question so simple it almost feels insulting. You invest $1,000 at 5% annual interest. After 5 years, what do you have? Not a trick. Not an IQ test. Not advanced math. Just the most basic idea in modern finance. Money can grow on its own, and the growth compounds. And yet the majority of working adults, people who sign mortgages, swipe credit cards, contribute to retirement plans, and spend decades inside the financial system couldn't answer it correctly. That isn't just a statistic, it's a warning label. Because if you don't understand how 1,000 becomes more than 1,000, then you also don't understand what happens when 1,000 becomes a debt at 20% interest. You don't understand why the minimum payment feels like relief while it quietly guarantees you stay in place. You don't understand why your savings account grows like a houseplant in winter, while the price of everything you need grows like wildfire. And when you don't understand those mechanics, you don't just make bad choices, you become predictable. And in finance, predictability is profitable. Here's the part that should make you sit up. This isn't about intelligence. It's not that people are incapable of learning. It's that they were trained to learn other things. You can meet adults who can recite facts they haven't used since childhood, yet they cannot explain the forces shaping the next 40 years of their lives. They know the rules of school, the rules of work, the rules of being responsible. But the rules of money, interest, inflation, fees, leverage, compounding, risk, those rules are treated like a private language, spoken fluently by institutions and barely understood by the people funding those institutions with their paychecks. And once you see that, the failure of that question stops looking accidental. It starts looking structural. Because what happens when a society produces millions of people who don't grasp compounding? You get a society where compounding works in only one direction. Upward. Upward for banks collecting interest. Upward for lenders collecting fees. Upward for asset owners watching prices rise. Upward for fund managers siphoning a small percentage that becomes enormous over decades. Upward for institutions that can survive volatility because volatility is their playground. Meanwhile, everyone else experiences compounding as a slow tightening, balances that never disappear, payments that never end, and retirement plans that feel like promises written in disappearing ink. So the question isn't why so many people failed. The question is, who benefits from that failure? Because financial ignorance creates dependence. Dependence creates obedience. Obedience creates stability for the system. If you don't understand how money grows, you stay dependent on wages. If you stay dependent on wages, you can't walk away. If you can't walk away, you will accept terms you would never accept if you had options. Debt becomes a leash, but it's sold as a ladder. Inflation becomes a tax, but it's described as normal. Fees become a siphon, but they're labeled small. And every one of those mechanisms is easier to run on a population that was never trained to notice them. That's why this story begins with a $1,000 question. Because that question is the doorway. On one side is a world where you can name what's happening to you. On the other side is a world where you're blamed for not starting earlier, not saving more, not investing smarter, while the system quietly runs its machinery exactly as intended. And once you understand that, you stop asking, "What did I do wrong?" And you start asking the only question that matters: what was I never taught to see? And from the moment you enter the adult world, you are handed a simple story about money. Work hard, be responsible, save a little every month, buy a home, avoid mistakes. If you do all of that, the story promises stability will follow, comfort will follow, retirement will follow. And if it doesn't, the implication is quiet but sharp. You must have done something wrong. This story is powerful because it feels moral. Discipline is rewarded. Carelessness is punished. Success becomes a reflection of character rather than structure. And that framing does something very important for the system. It shifts responsibility downward. When people struggle, they don't look at the machinery around them. They look inward. They blame themselves. But the illusion begins to crack the moment you compare effort to outcome. Millions of people did exactly what they were told. They worked for decades. They paid their taxes. They made their payments on time. They stayed loyal to employers. And yet they find themselves anxious, over-leveraged, and uncertain about the future. Not reckless, not lazy, just stuck. If the rules were fair, effort and security would at least loosely align. Instead, effort often leads to exhaustion, not independence. The illusion rests on a deeper assumption that money is neutral, that the financial system exists to help individuals grow alongside the economy, that banks, markets, and institutions are tools designed primarily for public benefit. In reality, the system is not neutral at all. It is directional. It channels value upward by default. Unless you understand how to resist that flow, consider how often risk is described. When markets rise, success is framed as skill. When markets crash, losses are framed as personal misfortune or bad timing. You are told to accept volatility as normal, even though volatility punishes those who depend on wages and rewards those who own assets. You are told inflation is unavoidable, even though its impact is wildly unequal. You are told debt is a tool, but never taught how interest turns time into a weapon against borrowers. Even education reinforces the illusion. You are taught how to be employable, not how to be independent. You are trained to follow instructions, meet deadlines, and perform tasks within systems you do not control. But the rules governing money, the rules that determine who accumulates and who struggles, are treated as optional knowledge. Nice to have, not essential. As if understanding the forces shaping your financial life were a hobby rather than survival literacy. This illusion is comforting because it offers hope without confrontation. If the system is fair, then all you need is more effort, more patience, more discipline. But that hope becomes a trap when it prevents you from seeing structural extraction. Because once you believe the game is fair, you will keep playing even as the odds quietly move against you. The truth is uncomfortable. The system does not fail when most people struggle. It functions. It produces workers who cannot stop working, consumers who cannot stop spending, borrowers who cannot escape interest, savers whose money loses value slowly enough that they blame themselves instead of the structure draining them. And that is the illusion you were sold. That stability is the reward for obedience, rather than the privilege of understanding how power actually moves through money. To understand why effort so often fails to produce security, you have to stop looking at money as a personal tool and start seeing it as a system of flows. Money is not just something you earn and spend. It is something that moves, compounds, leaks, and concentrates over time. And the direction of that movement is not accidental. At the center of the system is interest. Interest is time turned into leverage. When you borrow, time works against you. When you lend or own assets, time works for you. This single asymmetry explains more about modern inequality than almost any cultural debate. A household carrying credit card balances at 20% interest is not just paying for past purchases. It is surrendering future labor. Every month, a portion of tomorrow's work is already spoken for. That is not consumption. That is extraction. Now layer in compounding. Compounding does not care whether you understand it. It rewards scale and patience automatically. A bank collecting a few percentage points from millions of borrowers compounds upward effortlessly. A fund manager skimming 1 or 2% in fees compounds quietly for decades. Meanwhile, a worker trying to save from wages compounds slowly, if at all, because their starting base is small and constantly interrupted by expenses, emergencies, and inflation. The math is the same, but the starting positions are not. Then, there is inflation, the silent partner in the system. Inflation reduces the value of cash over time, which punishes savers and wage earners first. If your income rises slower than prices, you are moving backward even while working harder. But inflation also inflates assets. Stocks, real estate, and businesses rise in nominal value as more money enters the system. Those who already own assets are protected. Those who don't are priced out. Inflation is often described as a general rise in prices, but functionally, it is a redistribution mechanism. Debt, assets, and inflation all converge inside institutions. Banks do not primarily make money by storing cash. They make money by creating credit. When a bank issues a loan, it creates money that did not exist before, then charges interest on it. That interest must come from real economic activity, from your labor. The system expands by pulling future productivity into the present and charging rent on it. Retirement systems follow the same logic. Most people believe they are investing, but in practice they are intermediated. Their money passes through layers of management, fees, and market exposure they do not control. The risk is socialized downward. If markets crash near retirement, the loss is personal. If markets surge, the gains are partially skimmed by institutions that face no comparable downside. Once you see this structure, a pattern emerges. Wealth is not primarily built by working harder inside the system. It is built by positioning yourself on the side where time, compounding, and inflation work in your favor. The system does not teach this because widespread understanding would weaken the flow. Fewer borrowers, fewer captive workers, less predictable extraction. This is why the system feels exhausting rather than empowering. It is not broken. It is calibrated. And it works best when the people inside it believe they are failing individually rather than being processed collectively. Once you understand how money actually moves, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who is positioned to benefit from that movement? Because every system has winners, not by accident, but by design. And in this system, advantage flows toward those who sit closest to money, creation, asset ownership, and asymmetrical risk. At the top of the structure are financial institutions. Banks profit from credit expansion. They create money through lending, charge interest on it, and transfer risk outward. When loans perform, banks collect steady returns. When loans fail at scale, losses are often absorbed by the public through bailouts, inflation, or policy interventions. This is not moral judgment. It is structural reality. The system is engineered so that failure at the top threatens the entire economy, while failure at the bottom is treated as personal responsibility. Next are asset owners. People and institutions that own stocks, real estate, businesses, and intellectual property benefit from inflation and liquidity injections. When central banks intervene to stabilize markets, they raise asset prices first. Those already inside the market see their wealth expand without additional labor. Those outside face higher entry costs. This is why periods of crisis so often coincide with rising inequality. The shock hurts workers, but the response rewards owners. Then there are intermediaries, fund managers, insurers, consultants, advisors, and financial service firms. Their profits are often detached from outcomes. Fees are collected regardless of performance. A 1% fee sounds trivial, but over decades it becomes a massive transfer of wealth. These actors occupy a protected layer where scale does the work. They don't need to predict the future. They just need volume. Governments also play a role, though not in the way people are usually taught. Public debt, monetary policy, and taxation systems often stabilize the structure rather than disrupt it. When crises occur, policy responses tend to prioritize systemic stability over individual relief. That means preserving institutions first, households second. Again, not conspiracy priority ordering. Governments manage risk at the macro level, even when that means pain at the micro level. And then there is everyone else. Wage earners, small savers, people whose primary asset is their time. They carry the most exposure and the least insulation. Their income stops if they stop working. Their savings erode quietly. Their debt compounds relentlessly. They are told to be patient, disciplined, and optimistic, even as structural forces limit their mobility. What makes this power map difficult to see is that no single actor needs to intend harm. The system rewards behavior that aligns with accumulation and penalizes behavior that depends on stability. Participants simply follow incentives. Over time, those incentives concentrate power upward. This is why understanding money changes your position. Not because it guarantees wealth, but because it reveals where leverage lives and where vulnerability hides. Without that understanding, people mistake outcomes for personal failure. With it, they begin to see the architecture that shapes those outcomes long before individual choices enter the picture. Every system reveals its true nature under stress. For the modern financial system, those moments are not rare anomalies. They are recurring pressure points built into the structure itself. And every time the pressure rises, the same groups absorb the shock while others are shielded from it. One pressure point is job insecurity. When the economy slows, wages are the first line of adjustment. Hours get cut. Layoffs follow. Income disappears instantly for workers, while debt obligations remain fixed. Mortgages, credit cards, student loans, they do not pause when your paycheck does. This mismatch turns temporary economic slowdowns into personal financial crises. The system depends on continuous labor, but offers no continuous protection. Another pressure point is market timing. Retirement accounts are framed as long-term safety nets, but they are exposed to short-term volatility. If markets crash early in your career, you are told to be patient. If they crash near retirement, patience is no longer an option. Decades of disciplined saving can be erased in months, through no mistake of your own. The risk was always there, but it was invisible until it mattered most. Inflation is another braking mechanism. It does not arrive as a dramatic event. It creeps. Groceries cost a little more. Rent rises faster than income. Insurance premiums climb. Over time, the margin between earning and surviving narrows. People respond by borrowing, not because they are reckless, but because they are cornered. Debt becomes a coping mechanism, and once debt enters the picture, the pressure compounds. Crises expose the final pressure point: asymmetrical rescue. When households fail, they are told to budget better. When institutions fail, they are rescued to protect the system. The financial crisis of 2008 was not an exception. It was a rehearsal. The losses were socialized downward. The recovery flowed upward. The message was unmistakable. Stability for the system matters more than stability for individuals. These breaking moments are not bugs. They are how the system resets without reforming. Stress clears out those without buffers and consolidates power among those with capital. Each cycle tightens dependence and reduces mobility. This is where many people finally feel something is wrong, but cannot name it. They feel exhaustion without explanation, anxiety without clarity. They blame timing, luck, or themselves. But what they are experiencing is structural pressure doing exactly what it was designed to do. Understanding these moments does not remove risk, but it changes how you interpret it. You stop seeing crisis as personal failure and start seeing it as a predictable feature of a system that rewards insulation and punishes exposure. If nothing changes, the trajectory is not difficult to predict. Systems built on extraction do not suddenly become generous. They become more efficient. The forces already shaping everyday life simply intensify, quietly at first, then unmistakably. Wage dependence deepens. As costs rise faster than incomes, more people rely on credit to maintain basic stability. Debt stops being a bridge and becomes permanent infrastructure. Each generation starts further behind than the last, not because they are less capable, but because the entry costs to independence keep rising. Housing requires larger down payments. Education carries heavier burdens. Retirement feels increasingly theoretical. Work stretches longer, not because people want to work, but because they cannot afford to stop. Asset concentration accelerates. When economic shocks occur, policy responses continue to prioritize liquidity and market stability. Asset prices recover faster than wages ever could. Ownership consolidates among those already positioned to absorb volatility. Over time, fewer people own productive assets, and more people rent access to everything: homes, transportation, software, even entertainment. The economy shifts from ownership to subscription, from equity to obligation. Financial decision-making becomes more constrained. Risk-taking, entrepreneurship, and mobility decline when failure carries catastrophic consequences. People stay in jobs they hate. They delay families. They postpone health decisions, not because they lack ambition, but because the margin for error has vanished. A system that requires constant participation punishes exit. Political tension rises as well. When economic pressure becomes chronic, frustration looks for outlets. People argue about culture, identity, and personalities, while the structural mechanics remain untouched. Complexity becomes a shield. The system is described as too technical to question, too interconnected to change. And so it persists, not through force, but through resignation. The most dangerous outcome is normalization. When instability becomes familiar, people stop expecting better. They lower their definition of security. They accept exhaustion as adulthood. They internalize anxiety as responsibility. At that point, the system no longer needs enforcement. It runs on belief. This future is not inevitable, but it is the default path. Systems continue doing what they were designed to do until understanding disrupts them. And disruption does not begin with revolution. It begins with recognition. At this point, the story comes full circle. What looked like a simple math question was never about math. It was a filter. A quiet sorting mechanism that separates those who can see how money behaves over time from those who are forced to live inside its consequences without understanding them. The system does not need everyone to be ignorant. It only needs most people to be. A small minority who understand compounding, leverage, inflation, and asset dynamics can operate freely within the structure, while the majority remain dependent on wages and exposed to risk. That imbalance is not sustained by secrecy. It is sustained by omission, by what is never taught, never emphasized, never treated as essential. Once you recognize that, something important shifts. You stop interpreting your financial life as a series of personal shortcomings. You stop accepting vague advice that always places responsibility on you while ignoring structure. And you begin to ask sharper questions. Not, how can I work harder? But, where is my effort flowing? Not, why am I behind? But, who benefits from the way this system is arranged? It's not way. This awareness does not magically dissolve debt or protect you from volatility. But it restores agency. It allows you to see money not as a moral test, but as a set of incentives, flows, and power relationships. And when you see that clearly, you are harder to manipulate, harder to guilt, harder to keep compliant through confusion. The most dangerous belief is that this is simply how things are and always will be. History shows otherwise. Systems change when enough people understand them well enough to stop playing blindly, not by opting out entirely, but by navigating with intent instead of habit. That is the real reason financial literacy is discouraged. Not because it would make everyone rich, but because it would make people less predictable, less dependent, less controllable. And that is why this story matters. If this reframed the way you think about money, stay with this channel. Share it with someone who still believes the problem is personal discipline rather than structural design. And subscribe, because history has already run this experiment before. The answers are there if you know where to look.